Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this special panel on Syrian refugees caught between stale policies and state interests. I'm sure there will be a few more people joining us, but let me go ahead and proceed for the sake of time. Proceed with introducing the panel and introducing the subject matter and some of the administrative announcements in the interim. As you walked in at the registration desk, there were several items for you to pick up. If you didn't, please, on your way out, there will be enough copies left. Please pick one. The first one is the program for today, and basically it has in it a summary of the event and the agenda, bios of all of our participants and speakers. So I will not basically, neither would my colleague Dennis in the introduction, use the full bios of everyone since you have them in front of you, but we'll give you a summary of that. In addition, our partners in this event, BCARS, the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies, brought in this policy paper, copies of this policy paper that is excellent and very relevant to the subject matter, entitled the Work Permit Initiative for Syrian Refugees in Jordan, where, of course, almost 1 million, if not more, refugees are right now residing, and I would also encourage you to pick a copy of this report. The third item I would like to announce is a series of infographics that our staff prepared for you dealing with the Syrian refugee issues, and I think you will find the infographics very useful in summarizing some of the statistics, some of the issues that we will be discussing at various points in the program. Let me begin again by a word of thanks and appreciation to BCARS for partnering with us. And just to put it succinctly, basically what brought us together is our commitment, first of all, our friendship, individually in terms of the leadership at BCARS, and I think our commitment in our missions for better understanding in this country of issues in the Arab world, including, as an example, is this vital issue that we are talking about today. So it is a topic that we both feel very strongly about, and that's what, again, brought us together to organize this event. And we hope, with special thanks, of course, to Dennis and to Paul and to their colleagues who are here from Boston, that we hope this will be the first in a series of events in the future, either here or in the Middle East, as we continue to cooperate together. In terms of the subject matter, let me say that as everybody knows, and looking around, scanning around the room, everybody here is in a way an expert on the region and has followed events in Syria. But for the sake of focusing our attention on the questions that we will be tackling today, let me say that the conflict in Syria, as you all know, has entered its 8th year. And still, unfortunately, no realistic end is in sight with regards to a political solution to this conflict, in spite of the ups and downs with regards to interest, whether on the part of the United States or on the part of the United Nations or what have you. It seems that we are still in the same predicament we faced 8 years ago. When you look at all the developments and the tools that were introduced, whether it's the de-escalation zone agreement, the number of refugees were not affected, whether they are external refugees, you're talking about about 23 million Syrians today. Almost 55% of them are refugees, between external refugees in different neighboring countries and between the IDPs, the internally displaced persons. You're talking about more than 55% of the population of the country. I mean, this is a massive tragedy of unknown, frankly, proportions. And the problem continues to grow in spite of these attempts. The Syrian people continue today to confront some mounting challenges. Of course, we know of the events of the past few days. On the 13th of April, the US, France, and the UK participated in airstrikes against certain targets, claiming that they were involved in the previous attack during the previous weekend in Douma, in Ghouta al-Sharqiyya, eastern Ghouta. And however, most of the follow-up seems to be like these attacks were of very limited nature and, of course, consequently are of very limited impact, particularly on the refugee issues. I mean, as people who are concerned with this issue and with the fate of the refugees, I feel, objectively speaking, that the events on the 13th, these strikes, did not bring the refugees one day closer to a political solution, nor 1 inch closer to returning home. So we are somewhat in the same predicament. We will be tackling different issues for you today, the different speakers who will be introduced in a bit. Basically, are the Syrian refugees today better off or any closer to returning home is the first kind of main theme of our conversation today. What are the problems that they do face, whether it's eventual return to their actual homes, whether it's integration into the host countries, whether it's a provision of status in the host countries, how they are being treated in terms of access to education, to healthcare. We have people affiliated with different NGOs and different organizations that have been involved in various aspects of the conflict, and they will be sharing their reaction to these developments. So clearly, there is a long and rugged road ahead for the Syrian people, as I said, particularly this 13.5 million estimated Syrians who are most directly affected, more than half the population, most directly affected as refugees or displaced people by this conflict. Our first speaker will be Karen AbuZayd. Karen Koning AbuZayd is well known to anybody who has been following events with regards to refugees and human rights for many years in the region, in particularly the Arab world. She currently serves as pro bono commissioner on the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic to the UN Human Rights Council. In 2016, she was appointed special advisor for the Global Summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. From 2000 to 2010, she worked for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in Gaza, that's UNRWA. Before joining UNRWA, Ms. AbuZayd worked for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, for 19 years in countries as diverse as Sudan, Namibia, Sierra Leone, Bosnia, Geneva, and Washington. And her more detailed bio is in the program. If you need to get more information on that, it is personal honor to introduce to you at this time Karen Koning AbuZayd to make her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalil. I'll have to look at that bio you've got, remember all those details of where I've been and what I've done. Yeah. I'm going to repeat a lot of the things that Khalil has already referred to, so bear with me. I think the things are worth repeating. In setting the scene for our illustrious speakers, as I was asked to do, I shall begin with a salute. I wish to congratulate the organizers for the timely and captivating framing of the subject of this event as caught between stale policies and state interests. No more appropriate subject could have been chosen at this precise moment, given the glaring evidence of stale policies and state interests, which became so obvious over the past week at the Security Council, expressed in the world leaders' reactions to the suspected chemical attacks in Syria. Without being disrespectful, I want to refer to a cartoon that appeared this week about the Security Council members sitting behind their nameplates, each one reading US first, Russia first, France first, UK first, China first. I think you get it, and it was for the rest other 10 members as well. I think it's a very accurate and well-displayed incident of the state interests, and it was led by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who we count on to move things along. At the same time, the policies, if any of the interventions that were made were really policies, informing the 2 days of Special Security Council sessions called to discuss the suspected attack, were ones we have heard so often from opposing sides, each one blaming the other for inaction or illegal actions, at times rather impolitely. No thoughts were in evidence regarding the interests of the Syrian people, especially the refugees and the displaced, suffering for more than 7 years under bombardment, sieges, and displacement, much of it imposed or exacerbated by foreign interference. Nowhere have the tragic consequences of today's topic, I repeat, stale policies and state interests, been more precisely and disturbingly captured than during these Security Council sessions. Obvious issues and questions arise from the years of devastating conflict in Syria, prolonged by stale policies promoted by both internal and external actors, and also by the multiplication of states and other parties involved, many at odds with each other for a variety of reasons with little relationship to Syria. State parties and non-state parties, including terrorist groups, grow increasingly emboldened, while armed opposition groups proliferate and complicate any possibility of progress toward ending the conflict. Assertions around the latest suspected chlorine attack in eastern Ghouta raise again the same stale, but unfortunately still pertinent, so still on the table because they need to be addressed. The policies and questions about whom to blame, what to do, which divert efforts that could and should be devoted to tackling the larger issue of ending the conflict and addressing the very real and still growing challenges facing the Syrian people. Hence the importance this morning of turning to the experts and practitioners to examine questions related to the so far 7-year tragedy in Syria with a view to advancing strategies that might address the critical issues involved and provide some positive thinking and hope for the future that for the 6 million Syrian refugees and the 6.5 million internally displaced persons, what they are facing. There seems to be few grounds for optimism at the moment or an expectation of a positive outcome anytime soon. It's not an easy or enviable brief for our speakers, to be sure. As for my own brief, I'd like to point out the obvious, that the scene to be set is deep and wide, the humanitarian issues themselves being a result of and intertwined with military, human rights, religious, economic, and most of all, political aspects of the devastating Syrian multi-pronged war. This description is especially relevant in the context of looking forward. Beyond the misery wrought by approximately 500,000 deaths, I want to make a point of that. I saw several references in this past week to 150,000 deaths. We have certainly counted 500,000. What can be done for the nearly 6 million refugees and for their host countries, particularly Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, even Europe, and for the 6.5 million internally displaced, plus the thousands who have lived or are living still under siege and those who are hosting their displaced countrymen and countrywomen? Add the millions of children who had no formal education and suffered serious trauma over the past 7 years. How are properties to be retrieved and businesses revived? Is it possible for Syria to be restored as a unified state? How to address the enmities and the deeply felt wishes for revenge? What to expect from the several foreign powers, both states and armed groups, some of them terrorists, who have aided and abetted the conflict, especially those still embedded in the Syrian territory? Is it possible for the millions of Syrians who've suffered egregiously, physically and/or materially, to seek and be accorded justice? What are the prospects for Syrians to enjoy their human rights and benefit from the international humanitarian and human rights law? Can Syria's and the region's historical and cultural riches be recovered? And the overall bigger question, is it possible for Syria to be rebuilt? How and with which material and human resources? In addressing these questions, it's imperative that the needs of the refugees and internally displaced Syrians are put at the front and center of peace-building initiatives and negotiations. Parties to the conflict and its resolution must ensure adequate protection of and access to basic services, medical care, and the right to return, including a guarantee of safety and property rights. This will require a mechanism that ensures that housing, land, and property rights are respected for both refugees and internally displaced Syrians. This is certain to be a lengthy, technical process requiring careful consideration of existing property rights and the repeal of existing discriminatory laws, in addition to identifying and providing documentation for families and individuals. Birth registrations must be enabled and access given to all who need to gain or regain their legal identity to ensure the realization of the most fundamental human rights. The panelists are asked to examine questions of how to address the issues of Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons, and of those who host them, both internally and externally. How will years of problems related to integration and loss of documentation be overcome? What can be done for the children who have missed years of schooling, for others of all ages who are in serious need of health care? Are there opportunities for employment as refugees or IDPs? And what are the prospects when the displaced may be able to return to their war-torn neighborhood or war-torn country? Are the many actors from the United Nations and civil society, as well as governments, thinking about and working to ensure the human rights of Syrians of all ages, of those who've taken refuge outside, in neighboring countries or further afield, as well as those inside Syria, particularly the internally displaced? In these past 7 years, have those who have become involved in the Syrian conflict from afar and on the ground, including directly with the Syrian people, been able or willing to think about the consequences of their actions and the future? Obviously not. And this disregard for the conditions of the Syrian people is unlikely to change as long as the war continues relentlessly in most of the country, now divided among a variety of external warring parties supporting different internal warring parties. The description of today's session asks the question, how can the international community better advocate for refugee rights while ensuring Syria's youth are not left behind? And whether the involved actors can work together more effectively to provide a just, viable, and collaborative response to this protracted humanitarian crisis. I've been a commissioner on the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, investigating and reporting on abuses and violations in the Syrian Arab Republic since the summer of 2011. We, as commissioners, are supported by a team of 25 highly qualified and experienced investigators, analysts, military experts, and others working full-time in the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They are interviewing Syrians, visiting refugees on the ground, and analyzing information from all possible sources about facts and action on the ground. On the basis of our findings and conclusion over these nearly over 7 years, I am tempted to suggest that the question cannot be answered easily, and certainly not definitively, as long as the conflict, the war, no longer goes on. It's not only about territory or resources, and as ever, not about the human beings. And this continues. How to end the conflict and move on, given the multiple parties and interests involved, must be answered and acted upon first. Certainly, there is good and humanitarian work in place for many of the refugees, as well as for some of the internally displaced persons, at least when those providing assistance, particularly inside Syria, are able to maintain a presence and implement their programs. Host countries and their citizens have been, for the most part, generous and correct in welcoming and providing for refugees, and internal local communities have assisted their affected neighbors. None of this, of course, substitutes for the advantages which many Syrians had in the past: the security of employment, of property, the comfort and resources of one's own family and community. Syria is now a country torn into pieces, with local and foreign armed groups, terrorists, neighbors, and even foreign governments having established themselves in and now controlling parts of Syrian territory and those who are resident therein. Many groups now have, or think and act like they have, a stake in either aiding or occupying sections of the country, and it's difficult to conceive at this moment of any of these groups giving up their current roles and beginning to work together, in the words of the program description, and I'll repeat it, to provide a just, viable, and collaborative response to this humanitarian crisis. I hope I am unduly pessimistic, and there is an international, political, human rights, peacemaking body or initiative that can bring together the competing parties now exerting their hegemony in Syria, relying on those with good intentions and able to exclude those who do not have the interests of the Syrian people or Syria as a country at heart or mind. Or perhaps, best of all, we should advocate and work toward providing the necessary means, incentives, and motivations for Syrians themselves to recover and rebuild their country together. I'm eager, as you too must be, to hear the thoughts, recommendations of our panel of experts, and from you in the audience, trusting that there are ideas that will reassure us that we may see Syria at peace and recovering sooner rather than later. I thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for your valuable keynote remarks and particularly directing us in the right directions in terms of the questions that you have raised for the panelists who will begin in a couple of minutes. I'd like to remind the audience that you can follow today's events and future activities on Arab Center, Washington, D.C., Arab Center, WDC, and at BCARS, BCARS, space Boston. I would like at this moment to turn the microphone on to my friend and colleague, Dennis Sullivan, who is the director of the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies, to introduce the panelists and to basically chair the panel and the question and answer session. And again, as a reminder, the cards and the pencils in front of you are for the Q&A session. If you have a remark or preferably a question, please identify yourself, your affiliation, and address your question to one of the panelists. And Karen was also gracious to stay for the rest of the panel and to be also participant in the Q&A at the end of the panel. Dennis, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Khalil. Thank you also to Lana at the Arab Center for all the work, and everybody at the Arab Center for bringing us together, and this panel, which I'm very honored to introduce. And just to alert those of you in the DC area who haven't heard of BCARS, i.e. 99% of you, because we are based in Boston and our work tends to be focused in the Middle East. I just wanted to reiterate that what you see before you today is exactly what we in BCARS have been striving to do for the last 5 years. And again, I have to say, with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, without them, our activities would be just great ideas. But this partnership that we're doing today with the Arab Center, bringing together academics and practitioners, folks from the UNHCR, from NGOs, from the Arab Center, and from academics in Boston and around and Chicago, our great partner, Karen AbuZayd, who's worked with us for the last couple of years. This is what we want to do, and again, you can, please look for us and bring us your ideas as well for future partnerships. We do research, we do policy, we do practical applications of the ideas that we try to generate in panels like this. Without further ado, again, I'm just so pleased to introduce this panel. I have to also be timekeeper with Lana in the background, so we have to keep it to about 10 minutes per speaker so that we could also have a nice question-answer portion with the rest of you. So I'll just introduce them all now, and then they will continue in order. I think we've all agreed to sit here just for the ease of having our talks listened to in a timely manner. So again, our first speaker, and this will be the order as you see us on this panel, Daryl Grisgraber is the Senior Advocate for the Middle East and North Africa at Refugees International. Jana Mason will follow. Jana is Senior Advisor for External Relations and Government Affairs at UNHCR based here in DC. Mary Jane Deeb, many of you already know, member of the board of this great center, and a longtime colleague of mine in the Middle East Studies world. Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of African and Middle Eastern Division at the Library of Congress now. And Mohammad Al-Ahmad, Assistant Teaching Professor at Georgetown University. All of their bios are in your folder here, so that's why we're refraining from doing that, to give them more time. So, Daryl, if you would lead us off, and thank you.
Thank you. Do I need to?
I think it's on automatically.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, good, thanks. Hi, good morning. Thanks for being here. I'm Daryl. I cover the Middle East and North Africa for Refugees International. We don't provide services, we're an advocacy organization, so I spend my time as much as possible on the ground looking at what's going on in humanitarian response, what's working and what's not. We've been covering the Syria conflict for 7 years now, and it's been a while since I was allowed inside Syria. I mean, for our own security reasons, of course. But I'm actually just back from there a couple of days ago, so this was really good timing for the panel. I was also really happy with this particular invitation because it specified that we need to start looking at the humanitarian situation again. I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and so to me, it seems like there's never a lack of attention on the humanitarian issues, but people outside of this field assure me that the attention is drifting away little by little. So this was a great choice of topic for the panel. So as everybody knows, the conflict recently entered its 8th year. And while the political nature of the situation is just going to be what it's going to be, the humanitarian situation really has managed to continue deteriorating over 7 years. It's kind of amazing that it keeps on going downhill. I don't want to say that there haven't been some successes and improvements along the way, because there have been, right? The UN, the INGOs, the local Syrian groups as well, local authorities in parts of Syria have all been really working hard to give humanitarian support and assistance to people, and in many cases are doing a fairly amazing job in spite of circumstances. The local Syrian groups in particular, it's been really sort of inspiring to watch them develop and come into their own. Many of them were created in response to this conflict. So, they're 7 years old in many cases at the most, and they have done some amazing stuff, both in protecting people and offering support, and it's been really a privilege to watch that. The cross-border resolution that most of you are probably familiar with, that was an important step as well. And while it's not necessarily making everything work perfectly and the process is not always smooth, that has been an improvement, right? Because there was a time when literally no aid was getting into Syria across the borders. So it's kind of up and down as far as what the international community has been able to do. But the overall vision of the humanitarian situation is it's quite bad. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. So there are 6.5 million people internally displaced in Syria. More than 11 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. And this is in addition to the 5 million refugees who are in the neighboring countries. And I think Jana will be addressing that in more detail for us. And there's this impression sometimes that people who didn't leave Syria maybe didn't leave because things weren't as hard for them, so they didn't have to escape. And in fact, it may seem counterintuitive, but in fact, many of the people who are left in Syria are worse off because they did not have the resources or the ability to get out of the country when they could. And make no mistake, the refugees are living in an incredibly difficult situation. They're far away from home. It has been difficult to get assistance for them as well. And so it's a hard life. But for people who are stuck inside the country, it is equally difficult for different reasons, and many of them would have liked to leave and simply never had that opportunity available to them. I also want to make clear that even for people who are not internally displaced in Syria, their situation is the same as for those who are internally displaced, right? There's no electricity, there's no water, food is scarce, the healthcare system is broken, and even if you're still living at home, all of those things affect your ability to have a decent standard of living daily in your daily life. If you're then displaced internally, say 3 cities away or maybe across the country, it becomes even harder, right? Because you still have all those lacks and challenges, but you're not in a familiar community where you might be able to figure out how to get support. So it's really, we talk in terms of IDPs, the internally displaced people, but in fact, for everyone inside Syria right now, everything is a tremendous difficulty and everybody needs some sort of assistance. I was in northeastern Syria a couple of days ago, and it really became clear to me there how much the humanitarian situation not only needs to be addressed and shored up, but what the sort of spillover effects are going to be if it is not shored up. I tend to look at things in terms of, do people have shelter? Do people have clean water? Is there electricity? Can the kids go to school? All of these things are super important. All of them need to be addressed. But it is also really clear that in the areas that are under Kurdish control and under control of the Syrian Democratic Council, there really needs to be some serious support. The progress that's been made, the stability they have it's important, and it's really, really fragile. And humanitarian aid is not a solution to stabilization, right? But it's interesting, you can see very clearly how much that is the basis of whether or not things are going to continue to move forward in any sort of productive way. The conditions that prevent people from going home, say from the surrounding countries, are also the same ones that prevent the internally displaced from moving back. And getting people back into Syria and back into some sort of livable life is going to be really important to the future of the country. And so there's a lot to be said for the conflict areas. There are all sorts of reasons people can't go back, of course. But even in what we're calling the safer areas, the situation is so complex. In particular, some of the cities we visited are just so heavily contaminated with IEDs. I've never seen anything like it. Even Iraq does not compare in a lot of ways. People are continuing to return because they don't want to be displaced anymore. They know there's no house. They know there's no electricity. They know there's no water network, but they're tired of being displaced. They're coming back to Raqqa, for example. They are removing IEDs on their own, and as you can imagine, it's ending really badly in many cases. Local authorities are trying to inform people about what's going on and say this area is not safe, but people are going to do what they're going to do sometimes. And spontaneous returns can't be prevented a lot of the time, but we can make them more safe and more sustainable by providing the right types of support. The efforts to remove mines and IEDs from Raqqa in particular they're moving ahead. There are a number of actors working. Everyone has a plan. They're all trying to cooperate, but it's slow and really painstaking work, as you can imagine, right? And again, the level of contamination is incredibly heavy in these places. And if that is not taken care of in a fairly systematic, concentrated way, humanitarians can't work in these areas either, and that has been a huge impediment to the response in northeast Syria. So in addition to not having enough actors working there, because it's quite hard in many cases for INGOs to work in the northeast, it is difficult for the United Nations to work there. The local Syrian groups are great and they're working so hard, but they have a very limited capacity. But until all of these things can be put together in the areas made safe for humanitarian response, we're kind of right in the place where we started, which is some people are safe, some people will go home and not be safe, and we may well lose them. And again, the ability to live there safely and to rebuild from this point is going to be shaky if it can't be made a livable place. So the urgency of not just securing territory, for example, and keeping people alive, but making it feasible for them to go home is really what we have to concentrate on next for this part of Syria. And humanitarian assistance is a part of how all of this is going to happen. The fact of the lack of response is something that can be worked with. The United Nations is doing some really interesting things in northeast Syria under their sort of official procedures, and Jana, maybe you'll talk a bit more about that. In addition, there are lots of groups that have chosen to be active in the northeast rather than to register with Damascus, because this is where they have chosen to operate. So there's plenty going on, and I really cannot overstate just how hard people, the local groups in particular, are working at this. And one of the things that we always look at is, what are the local groups doing and how can they be supported to get this done better? Because these are the groups that are going to stay, make a long-term investment in humanitarian assistance and reconstruction, and really make things go forward. So there's really good capacity in northeast Syria, and from what we've seen on other missions, there's good capacity in the rest of Syria as well. But there has to be support. We have to really be thinking all the time about how we are enabling these groups to do the best work they can do. They all say they want capacity building and training, and it's possible to do that for them as part of the humanitarian response. In conclusion, I would just say humanitarian assistance in Syria everywhere remains urgent, in spite of the fact that we are 7 years in, and technically a lot of sort of practitioners and academics wouldn't call this an emergency situation anymore. It is a humanitarian disaster, and it is a crisis, and the emergency relief is still a very important part of what needs to be done. In addition to that, the humanitarian assistance commitment needs to be long-term. This is not going to end next year. It's probably not going to end in 2 years. And even if it ended tomorrow, again, humanitarian assistance in keeping people alive, the emergency relief, is the basis of moving forward from here. And there has to be a longer-term commitment to that. And supporting the local groups to do whatever they can in that response is going to be really crucial, and making sure that this continues and that Syria gets back on its feet and is taking care of itself. Syrians are so incredibly capable of doing this for themselves, but right now they need support from all of us. Thanks very much.
Daryl, thank you. Before I turn it to Jana, I must apologize. I neglected to mention that Radwan Ziyad, thanks to our friends in Homeland Security, is unable to visit us, and the United States of America, first of all, or this panel. So he is unable to return to the United States. And thanks to Imad Harb, the Director of Research and Analysis at the Arab Center, Imad is stepping in, and I neglected to introduce him at the beginning. So my apologies to that, and now to Jana.
Thanks, Dennis, and thanks so much for the opportunity to address you on this. Like Daryl and like so many others on this panel, certainly like Karen and probably like many of you in this room, I have been given the opportunity to speak at and attend conferences on the Syrian refugee crisis for the past 7 years. I don't say that happily. Several of us were talking earlier about how we and many others had hoped that this would be one of the rare short-term crises when it first happened. That didn't prove to be the case. So here we are 7 years on, and I think it's with a heavy heart that all of us are still talking about this after 7 years. I will say for the first 3 or 4 years of that, it seemed to be, for at least those of us I'm with the UN Refugee Agency here in Washington, it was kind of all Syria all the time. We, of course, were addressing multiple other crises as well. My organization, the UN Refugee Agency, leads the international response to refugee crises. We work in over 130 countries, so work continued. But in terms of attention here in DC, Syria was driving 95% of that for the first 3 or 4 years. Then I did start to see a little bit of a waning of attention. We had other crises. People were focused on Ukraine, northeast Nigeria, Boko Haram, Mali, the Bay of Bengal Rohingya situation. Recently, it's been the Rohingya again, and so many other crises. But I also see, maybe it's in part due to the 7-year anniversary, maybe it's in part due to the renewal of conflict in East Ghouta and other areas, and resumption of airstrikes, a return to attention on Syria. And again, that's not a happy thing, but it's definitely welcome from the perspective of a refugee organization or humanitarian assistance organization to see that attention remains on this crisis. Because as Daryl said, this is not the time to retreat. I'm going to give you a few key messages and some stats and talk about the refugee situation in the region from sort of a holistic perspective. In the Q&A, if people want to talk about one particular country, I can address that a little bit, but I want to sort of give you an overarching view of how things look. But starting with key messages, if there are 3 key messages I want to leave you with before we get into the discussion. The first is that the violence in Syria continues to drive the largest refugee crisis in the world. There are newer crises. There are crises that are escalating faster, like the Venezuela situation, but this is still the largest refugee crisis in the world. I'll talk in a few minutes about the specific numbers in each country. They appear to be somewhat static, but they're more fluid than people might think just by looking at the numbers. So it's continues to be a driver, largest refugee crisis in the world. The second key message is that, I think you would have guessed this by now, but as the other speakers have made clear, conditions are not yet conducive for return, for large-scale, voluntary, organized return. That doesn't mean we're not thinking about it and preparing for it. It doesn't mean that some returns aren't happening. I'll talk in more detail about that in a moment, but we are not advocating in any way, shape, or form for large-scale voluntary return at this point. The situation is just not ripe for that. The third and last key message, and I'll get more into this, is that, as I said, this is not the time to retreat. The host countries that are hosting over 5 million Syrian refugees, close to 6 million Syrian refugees, continue to be in tremendous need of assistance, maybe now more than ever. But fortunately, if there's one shred of good news in this situation, it's that some new thinking is happening about how to better help those countries and also refugee hosting countries around the world. So there are some new approaches. There's some excitement around thinking about how we address protracted refugee situations. Because while this does remain an emergency, it's what we sometimes call a protracted emergency, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's what we have. We still have a refugee crisis, but it's gone on so long now that once we hit 5 years, we consider it a protracted crisis. We have some that go on for much more than 7 years or 5 years. I hope that won't be the case in Syria, but we've already seen that we can't be thinking just short term. We need to be thinking about medium and long term as well, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But to go back into a little bit more detail on the numbers, as I said, still largest refugee crisis in the world. Now, these numbers change on sometimes a daily basis, but the facts and figures I'll give you are as of last month, March 2018. Turkey, still now the largest refugee hosting country in the world, hosting over 3.5 million registered Syrian refugees. And sometimes you'll hear differences in the numbers. That's because we have formally registered refugees, and then you have, for various reasons, people that aren't registered, so the actual numbers are probably a little bit higher. So sometimes you'll hear differing refugee numbers. Unlike the rest of the countries in the Syria region, where UNHCR, my agency, is responsible for registration, the Turkish government is responsible for registration in Turkey. So we get the numbers from them. So it's 3.5 million, a little bit more. Compared to March 2017, this is an increase in over 600,000. This is due to the fact, in many cases, because of new people coming forward for registration that weren't registered before. It's also a result of births. It's also a result of some people entering the country although, as I'll discuss in a minute, there aren't too many new arrivals into the host countries, including in Turkey. But Turkey has the greatest number, probably, of new arrivals in the last year. So a little over 600,000 change from March 2017 to March 2018. Lebanon, we've for a long time now said roughly 1 million Syrian refugees. It was larger at one point. It may be slightly less than 1 million registered refugees at this point, although not everyone in Lebanon comes forward for registration. So it's actually technically a decrease in about 15,000 from this time last year. Lebanon is one of the countries where resettlement of Syrians has happened to the U.S. or elsewhere. It's also a place where some individuals, particularly members of Christian minorities and others, have access to other visas and other ways to leave the region. So some people enter Lebanon short-term, and from there have ways to relocate to other parts of the world. So that's why you see a little bit more of a decrease in terms of Lebanon. But roughly for the past couple years, hosting around 1 million Syrian refugees. So Turkey is the largest refugee hosting country in the world, but Lebanon is the largest per capita refugee hosting country in the world. And that per capita status is critical. I'm sure all of you are familiar with how tiny Lebanon is, so the refugee impact on Lebanon cannot be overstated. Jordan, official number is still about 657,000. It's just a slight increase over this time last year. Very few people formally entering Jordan. Iraq, about 250,000, about 248,000 Syrian refugees in Iraq, 97% of them in the Kurdistan region, a slight increase over last year. And then Egypt, about 126,000 Syrian refugees, a slight increase, and then collectively in North Africa, about 30,000. We also, of course, have Syrian refugees and asylum seekers in the U.S., in Europe, other countries as well, but obviously the Syria region is where most of them are being hosted. And this is important to reiterate. A lot of the media would have you think that Syrians leave their country and immediately come to the U.S. or go to Europe. That is not the case. The vast majority of Syrian refugees are have always been in, and will remain in the neighboring countries. So again, still largest crisis in the world. Now, despite this ongoing violence, as I mentioned, relatively few Syrians have entered these host countries in recent years, and that's because of what we refer to as managed borders. I won't say closed, because in each country there are specific categories of people who may be able to enter for various reasons, but after the first few years of large numbers, continuing inflow, the countries decided they needed to tighten and what we call manage their borders. So very few people still arriving. That notwithstanding, these host countries continue to be very, very generous hosts, not only because they're among the largest or actual largest hosts of refugees, but because of their generosity in letting people go to school, letting people work. We can talk more about that, but we can't overstate the fact that they have been and continue to be incredibly generous hosts of refugees. But despite that generosity, conditions for Syrian refugees in the region are deteriorating. I remember after the first 2 or 3 years talking about this crisis, I was always saying they are exhausting their savings. They don't have much money left. They don't have many resources left. Well, those savings have long been exhausted now. And we've done studies that show the majority of Syrian refugees in the region are living below the poverty line. In fact, in Lebanon, almost 60% of households are in what we call extreme poverty, living on less than $3 US dollars a day per person. As a result, many of them are relying on what we euphemistically call, and I hate this term, negative coping strategies, which sounds like an academic term. But when we say negative coping strategies, we're talking about child labor, early marriage, survival sex, very, very negative response to their plight. However, access to livelihoods in these countries is increasing, and this would be a good thing to discuss in the Q&A. Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon were among the first countries, not just in the region, but in the world, to make commitments to increase livelihood opportunities, work permits for refugees in these countries, and again, to allow children to go to school. There's a lot we can say in that regard, but these work permits are really the key, not only to the medium term for Syrian refugees, but to the future, when they go back to Syria or go elsewhere in the world. The situation for children continues to be troubling, despite efforts that have resulted in over 1 million Syrian refugees in the region having access to school. About 40% of school-age Syrian refugees still are out of school. I don't have to say what this means in terms of the future, not only of these children and their families, but of Syria and of other countries where they may make their home. Women and girls, as in any displacement crisis, women and girls tend to be disproportionately impacted. Sexual and gender-based violence remains a key issue that we continue to respond to. So as I said, conditions aren't conducive for large-scale return, but as Daryl mentioned, people are returning. A lot of these are spontaneous returns because the situation is so desperate in the host countries, they decide to go back to parts of Syria that are relatively safe. So an estimated 77,000 Syrian refugees returned in 2017, and an estimated 760,000 internally displaced persons returned to Syria. Usually you see IDP returns before you see refugee returns. But one thing about IDP returns is that when Daryl gave you the number of internally displaced persons in Syria, that number often looks somewhat static as well, but it belies the fact that many Syrians are displaced multiple times. We recorded something like 2 to 3 million new displacements last year of people that went one place and then went somewhere else. So people inside Syria are displaced over and over again. Some of them become refugees, some of them don't. Some of those who become refugees go back to Syria and are displaced again. So returns are happening on their own in relatively small numbers, but not large-scale organized voluntary return. That doesn't mean we're not talking about it and preparing for it. Sometimes UNHCR and humanitarian groups get criticized for talking publicly about preparations for return. But again, we know from long experience, if we don't start preparing for it early, it won't work when the time is right. Daryl talked about people on their own trying to remove IEDs. It's a lot better if professionals can do so. So if we remove the IEDs, if we repair, a lot of times when a city is liberated, so to speak, from the occupiers, people leave and they take a lot of the infrastructure with them, even door handles and refrigerators and things. If we can not only remove IEDs, but prepare the ground for when people come back, it'll be a lot more successful. So the final point, again, is that this crisis is ongoing and it has not only regional but global implications. And that gets to the one area of good news that I mentioned, which is that this crisis has really generated a lot of new thinking in the international refugee and humanitarian community about how to respond to refugee crises. In 2015, when we saw over 1 million people, mostly refugees, some migrants, cross the Mediterranean and try to get to Europe, and we saw that tragic photo of little Alan Kurdi on a Turkish beach, all of a sudden it seems like the Western world just woke up to a crisis that we had already, and others, and you, had been telling them about. And a lot of thinking since then has gone into a new approach that involves the World Bank, other financial institutions, development partners, to really give a lot more assistance to refugee hosting countries and communities at the same time we're preparing for returns. So I'd be happy to talk further about that. It really is an exciting new approach, but the Syria crisis was really what generated a lot of that thought. So if there's any silver lining that you can find in this crisis, is that we're finally starting to get our act together in how we deal with refugee crises that are not addressed in the first few months or the first couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. Mary Jane, please.
Okay. First, disclaimer. So although I'm the chief of the African Middle East Division at the Library of Congress, The ideas expressed this morning are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the library. So I just want to get this out of the way, but I have to say this. I'm going to be addressing a little slice of the huge problems that have been addressed by everyone at this table. And that is the issue of education and a way of addressing, at least one way of addressing this issue. This year, I was invited by the Clusters Forum, which is a Swiss NGO, to participate on a panel entitled Refugee Education, Challenges and Solutions. And the participants, the panel took place in Davos during the World Economic Forum, and it's the overall theme of the World Economic Forum then was creating a shared future in a fractured world. So to create a shared future for those refugees is to integrate them into society by educating them and giving them the skills not only to survive, but also to thrive, and to enable them to acquire the skills they would need to rebuild their country once peace returns to the region, and we have to remain optimistic that peace will return. Education also reduces the risk of young refugees falling victim to criminals, to those making a living out of exploiting the poor, and to those darker ways of surviving that you mentioned so clearly. The group I was with was a group of people who came from the private sector. And the private sector, the companies, individuals, people with wealth who wanted to help in one way or the other. The issue was that they felt that there was difficulty, first of all, in getting information about exactly what was happening in refugee camps, in cities. They wanted updated information. Then they wanted to help in their own way. So in addition to international organization, UNHCR, and the organizations that we have been talking to, they wanted to help in their own way. And in order to do that, they wanted to have access to information, to better information. And there were a number of NGOs, small NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that talked about the problems that they were facing. First of all, there was, of course, the lack of updated information. As was mentioned before, people move, situation changes, people are bombed, and so the situation changes continuously. So it's very difficult to get current information. The other thing was that people who were on the ground spoke about problems of duplication, that is several organizations trying to do the same things, or funding going to the same projects, while other projects were left underfunded or not funded at all. They discussed the issue of administrative gridlock, both governmental and non-governmental, getting permits, allowing people to move, blockage of the way in which food was reaching people. They talked about funds being spent on overheads rather than on refugees. So those organizations and the people who wanted to help, the donors, also discussed the need to access and to make available technology to ensure that even the most isolated refugee camps could receive services. So, there were people from Microsoft, there were people from Google, there were people from major internet organizations. There were manufacturers, there were people in industry. They were in the audience and there were participants. And they wanted to help, but they wanted a specific way of accessing information about the groups that needed help. They also wanted to be able to monitor how their funds and how their money was going to be spent, because there were people there who spoke about funds going, supposedly charity funds going, not to the refugees, but being taken by organizations that claimed they were helping them, and then funding just trickling down to the refugees themselves. So they really wanted a clearer, more transparent way of trying to help directly the refugees. So in order to address some of those issues, I propose the creation of a refugee information hub, the role of which would be to facilitate and streamline the process of providing education to refugee children, and serve also at the same time as a transparent coordination and information release resource for relief organizations, technology companies, major donors, and others. So I'm focusing now on education, but the same concept of a information hub could apply to medical help, to health services, to housing, and to other forms of support. So the information hub would be an online, one-stop location to access resources on refugee education. So now I'll focus simply on education, but again, think about it. It could apply to medical issues, housing issues, and others. So that information hub would provide a platform where all organizations could have, for example, online chats and ask for help, where they would be directed to resources they needed and receive immediate feedback from other organizations working in the same field, and where they could find partners to cooperate with on various projects when going alone is difficult. So it's online, it's live, it is immediately accessible. This information hub would create a continuously updated database on refugees, their locations, their numbers, the conditions of the camps or the areas in the cities, the availability of basic services such as water and electricity, types of shelters, security concerns, accessibility. This information would help relief organizations find and select their target groups, cooperate with other relief groups. I'm talking about the private sector, but also in conjunction with international organizations. To better assess refugee needs, plan their contributions and educational programs more effectively. The information hub would have a database of educational materials, for example, and curricula in different formats and different languages, used successfully to teach refugee children in one location that could be minimally adjusted to meet similar needs in a different context. The information hub would also make accessible online immediately communication technologies used to transfer distance learning programs, as well as on-site education. And again, Internet Archive and others have the possibility to do that. The information hub would also create a database for educational reports prepared by relief organizations, including those of the United Nations organizations, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNRWA, and all the others. In other words, it would pool the information, make it available online, transparently, and make it accessible to those who subscribe and who focus on this. This would be, so materials in the languages for the children would be made available, the technology that could transfer and do distance teaching would be made available, images and statistics would be there available, people could call in and ask for help and be answered immediately as they came in. Changing situations would be monitored continuously, and that can be done. We have the technology, we have the willpower, there are donors all over the world who want to help. They just need to know and to be able to monitor what they're doing and how information is being transmitted and how their monies and their assistance is being done. Again, this is for education. It could be done for health. It could be done for housing. It could be done for any other unit. And it could be housed in Washington. It could be housed in Geneva. It could be housed in Cairo. It could be housed anywhere. But it would need to be a site that would be monitored by young people interested in helping and in pooling together the resources which are available where there is a will to help the refugees. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammad, please.
Does it work? Yeah. Good morning, and thank you for being here. I will be talking about the challenges facing Syrian refugees in terms of college education and job opportunities. Education is a vital need as important as security, health, and food. Young Syrian refugees face significant challenges that prevent them from accessing education. According to UNHCR, 61% of refugee children are enrolled in elementary school, compared to 91% globally. Only 23% of refugee adolescents are enrolled in high school, compared to 84% globally. Only 1% of refugee youths receive a higher education, compared to 36% globally. So it is different among Syrian refugees. It's 6% from Syrian refugees enrolled in higher education. So there are more than 2,000 university qualified Syrians who were either beginning or in the middle of their studies at the time the war broke out, who now go without education. Considering the increasing numbers of people without higher education, the threat of an entire lost generation looms if the international response is not immediate and relevant. Now, what are the specific challenges and how do we tackle them? To address this issue, I'll be focusing on Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, the three countries with the largest refugee populations. While there are about 3.5 million refugees in Turkey, the number of those enrolled in universities amounts to only 15,000. It is about 30%. In Lebanon, out of the 1 million refugees, only about 6,000 are enrolled. And in Jordan, out of the more than 600,000 refugees, only 15,000 are enrolled. It's about 4%. So there are four main challenges causing this gap between these numbers. The first is financial. Public universities cannot meet the scale of demand for Syrian refugees, and the grants cannot bridge the gap between demand and availability. Private universities have high tuition fees that are prohibitive for refugees. The second main challenge is language. So Arabic is the primary language in most universities in Syria. However, in Jordan and Lebanon, private and public universities teach in English, and in Turkey in Turkish. Even students who manage to pass the English language test suffer due to the specialized and technical nature of higher education language. The third issue is the lack of legal documentation attesting to grades or degree completion. These documents are almost impossible to obtain from the educational institutions, as many students are fleeing Assad's regime. Turkey, Norway, and Canada are using different mechanisms to verify students' level of education and grades, and they have been successful. But unfortunately, there is no mechanism for review in Lebanon or Jordan. The fourth and last challenge is the legal status. The legal status of students, refugees in Lebanon and Jordan present a challenging obstacle. Many potential students struggle to meet the relevant requirements to obtain residency. Now, I will be talking about employment issues and work permits for college graduates. Access to employment also presents a great deal of problems. Existing laws in these countries have not allowed Syrian refugees to obtain work permits, even though Turkey and Jordan have promised to ease this burden. A lack of access to employment for Syrian refugees in neighboring countries is linked to many political, social, and economic issues. The unemployment rate in these countries, for example, is very high. The refugees must compete with citizens who have similar specializations. And even they do find work, they are still not guaranteed work permits. The number of work permits issued to the refugees in these countries is very limited and are restricted to agriculture and construction. In Lebanon, 92% of refugees work without a permit. And those who do have a permit are also limited to sectors like construction, agriculture, and cleaning. As a result, refugees work illegally at below minimum wage, often in a human working condition and without life, accident, or health insurance. I believe solutions for these problems must come in the form of strategies that address the educational needs of refugees and the demands of the job market. Such planning must overcome local competition and deal with the problems of work permits. We have seen examples of this kind of a program before. One example is the Southern New Hampshire University program. This program provides refugees with an accredited undergraduate degree from the United States. It uses remote and digital job opportunities to connect graduates with international employers. The program additionally emphasizes technical and software skills that are ideal for the quickly developing sector of remote-based digital work. This university engages directly with employers, governments, and organizations, leveraging connections and social capital. Many who graduated from this program were able to secure good jobs in their places for refuge, and some even found work in international cooperations. As a final remark, I think this form of education program prevents refugees from having to rely on the governments of these countries to create economic policies to address their needs, which are not in sight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammad.
Good morning. The presentations that preceded me basically speak of one very, very important thing, is that the issue of refugees, Syrian refugees, is not a Syrian issue only. It's obviously an international issue that needs to be addressed and addressed carefully and in a very, very dedicated manner. Unfortunately, this is not something that we are seeing states really take care of and really address in a proper way. But basically, to talk about the refugees in a refugee issue, Syrian refugee issue, in a political atmosphere, we really have to know how are things in Syria today, and what environment are we talking about to be able to talk about rehabilitation, resettlement, rebuilding the country so it can really accommodate the millions who are outside and the millions who have been internally displaced. What we see today is basically a landscape of definitely, I mean, on the ground, the Syrian regime has basically almost completely succeeded in controlling what Bashar al-Assad, the President Bashar al-Assad, a while back called useful Syria, Syria that basically he controls, that he can extract revenue from, and basically can control politically as a political base for the regime. But yet at the same time, this is although he controls what he controls, it's also not only the control, the political and basically military control of these areas that's significant. It's also the control of what really is going to happen in these areas. You know, the panelists have not yet spoken about this, but you know, it is rumored and very credibly. I read somewhere last week that the regime is probably going to be asking people who to return within 30 days, otherwise all their properties and homes and whatever they will basically forfeit their properties. And if that happens, we're talking about a monumental demographic change that is going to be, we will be looking at a different Syria than what we had 7 years ago or what we have today. So this is a regime that is in control of a place that it wants to fashion to its own, in its own image. And this is what the international community is going to be, to have to deal with. We're also talking about a Russia that has really thrown all caution to the wind and is going with the regime and is allowing the regime to do whatever it wants to do. Supposedly, there were talks at Astana for some de-escalation zones that really were not necessarily de-escalation zones because the regime kept bombarding them. We're talking about a failed Sochi process in which the Russians and the Syrian regime tried to really basically ram down the throats of opposition, a settlement plan, so to speak. The regime or Russia are not interested in the Geneva process, which was an international process that basically paved the way for a political transition from authoritarian rule to a more democratic system. We're also talking about an environment in which where the regime controls, it doesn't control the areas all by itself, it also controls the area with the assistance of actual troops from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and their affiliated militias. So the regime, in a way, is trying to build a new Syria to its own image, but it's also enlisting the assistance of Russia and Iran to do the same. While we're watching this happening, we're also watching the international community not know really how to go about trying to solve what is today no longer a Syrian problem. It is an international problem. We cannot be talking about 6 million, 7 million people in neighboring countries and in Europe and elsewhere, and 6 or 7 million internally displaced people without thinking of what is the international responsibility for something called Syria. Are we really going to be basically forfeiting our responsibility to address an issue that is the basis of a lot of international chaos, so to speak. So when we look at the international environment, we're looking at the major power of the international environment, the United States, with basically no political vision, no strategy to deal with Syria, to deal with anything else associated with Syria or anywhere else or anything else. We're looking at an administration that is basically more interested in how it is perceived to be leading itself basically domestically, not necessarily internationally. It's allowing so-called shoddy policies to really lead the international effort to a different Syria, so to speak. Lately, the strikes against some Syrian positions that were supposedly involved in the chemical attacks in eastern Ghouta. We dubbed that as a mission, and it is a mission accomplished. It's really difficult to really see how the mission is accomplished if the regime can, instead of using chemical weapons, if we really succeeded in destroying the regime's chemical weapons capabilities, if dying from a barrel bomb is a better death than dying from chemical weapons. So we as an international community really dithers about what to do about Syria. More of the same is definitely going to happen. The latest strikes were definitely in the regime's benefit. The regime saw itself as and painted itself, and people who wanted to believe it saw it as this is the embodiment of the resistance to American imperialism. Everybody forgot that the regime itself has actually killed its own people and will always kill its own people to perpetuate itself in power. If the international community does not get in on the act and get in fast on the act, we're looking at a Syria that either is going to be a nucleus for the regime and for Russian interference and Iranian interference, or is going to be a Syria that is going to be a failed state that's going to invite all kinds of instability in the Middle East, as if the Middle East really needs more instability. So if the United States does not lead the international order, that is a big problem. At the same time, the United States cannot lead the international order because it does not have the institutional wherewithal and the institutional setup or the institutional commitment to do something about Syria, because without a resolution of the Syrian crisis has been with us for a little over 7 years. Without a resolution of the international crisis, we should not be surprised if the Lebanese state collapses under the impact of 1 million Syrian refugees, and actually also under the impact of its own incompetence. We should not be surprised if Turkey begins talking about, okay, well, you basically wore out your welcome mat, and this is something that is beginning to appear in Turkish newspapers about Syrian refugees have to go back home. We really can't take it anymore. Iraq is going through its own problems. So this Syria issue definitely requires an international effort, immediate international effort. America first, France first, Germany first. None of these really work anymore to address this very, very international problem. Thank you.
Yeah, just as a reminder, the process is we take questions or comments in writing. The cards in front of you and pencils are available next to them. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and raise your hand. Once you're ready, staff will pick up your cards and bring it to the chair here to read your questions. Please write legibly. He has a PhD in political science.
Thank you.
Didn't go to medical school.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so some of these are, some of these are addressed to all, and some are to some specific folks. I want to mention that Daryl has to leave for another event. in about 15 to 18 minutes. So if you have any questions specifically for her, please get those up to me. Otherwise, I'll just start randomly with some questions for all. And this is from Rafid Jabouri, Al-Arabi. Do you see a tendency in the regime's war efforts to change the demography in Syria? And if so, what are the long-term consequences? And this is for anybody who would like to address that.
I'll take that. Well, rumors are always rumors until they are really confirmed. But there has been a lot of rumors that the battle for Eastern Ghouta, for Ghouta in general, the environs of Damascus, is mostly is more demographic than it is actually regime control over the area. Of course, Eastern Ghouta under the control of the rebels is not good for the regime, obviously. I'm sorry, rebel control of Eastern Ghouta is not good for the regime. But yet at the same time, there has been this tactic has been used in Aleppo. It's been used in Homs. It's been used now lately in Eastern Ghouta, where supposedly you kick out combatants, people who are fighters, but yet at the same time you kick out with them tens of thousands of people. If the regime's threat of the 30-day limit to try to come back and claim your property, otherwise you forfeit it, if that really takes place, we're talking about a major demographic change, at least in the Ghouta area. The other rumors that have been around for a while is that a lot of people who are not even Syrian citizens are taking over some properties in very sensitive areas of the country, which is really, it really raises the specter of talking about maybe definitely changing demographically the makeup of Syria.
Unless no one else would like to respond further, I'd like to ask this question on behalf of Andy Maslowski, U.S. Department of State, to Daryl and Jana. Given the Syrian government's recent promulgation of a decree stipulating government, here's that PhD in political science, not medical technology. Given the Syrian government's recent promulgation of a decree stipulating government seizure, of property not claimed within 30 days, what can refugees and IDPs do now to preserve their property rights, and how can we help them?
Well, I'm looking at a document from my organization with a little bit of detail, and it's a work in progress. So this is all I know at the point. It doesn't answer the question what can be done, but what I do know at this point, I think what people have been referring to is media reports about a law that was reportedly introduced by the Syrian government, which, according to the reports, could result in the confiscation of lands of millions of displaced people. A lot of people, including my organization, is currently reviewing the law. What we do know right now is that it appears that, contrary to the media reports, the law at this point simply opens the possibility for government authorities to issue decrees to establish zones where an inventory of all property owners would be undertaken. This is obviously a bureaucratic statement. But at this point, no such decrees have been issued. There's no timeline for further action. And in addition, contrary to what we have heard in some of the media reports, the law does foresee that property claims could be made against this by both the owners of the property and a range of family members and legal representatives. There would also be a right to appeal on any decisions. So obviously this would be a worrying development, but at least the law does foresee that it's not 30 days and that's it, we grab the property. There's some process being foreseen. Again, this is all just initial reports, translations of the documents. What they can do to preserve it, maybe Daryl can address that a little bit further. But right now, I would just caution anybody to look with some skepticism about what's being reported in the media and really look into more of the details.
And I think if this is something that the regime decides it wants to do, I don't know what anyone can do to stop it, but I will say that There are ways after the fact that international agencies are dealing with figuring out who owned what when people, particularly when people don't have documents. Now, it's not ideal to do it after this is done, right? It's way more labor intensive, it's expensive, and it takes a very long time. But there are some creative new things happening, particularly with Iraqis in Mosul, trying to figure out who owned what property, get communities involved in verifying that, and getting it back to its rightful owners. So if there's not anything preemptive to be done, there are in fact processes that have been used after the fact to get property back to people, but it would be preferable, of course, not to have to go there.
If I may add just, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was going to say that there are groups, NGOs, for example, in Lebanon that have been working on the issue for a couple of years and doing quite a good job of getting in and out the documents, so people at least had the documents that related to their property. We had a meeting with them in Lebanon on one occasion, and then the next day we heard that there was a new decree that said you have to come back in person to claim your property. Doesn't matter if you have your documents, you have to be inside Syria, which of course that's impossible for most of the refugees, at least at this time.
Yeah, I know from the Lebanese case, we're talking about the Lebanese civil war between 75 and 89, 90. Squatters took over apartments, took over houses in the countryside, land, and some people still cannot go back to those lands that they owned, 40 years ago. So we're talking about a process that is very, very complicated, and added to this in this specific Syrian situation, state violence, state control over people's lives. That becomes really extra difficult.
There's a question to all. It's from Kelsey Henquinet, American Refugee Committee. To everyone, Mary Jane Deeb proposed an excellent idea for an international database. What are your thoughts, and would you use it in such a database?
Do you want me to comment?
Well, they were promoting your idea, and to see if anyone else. Huh? But
Yeah.
by all means, if you want.
No, I would just say that we were all scribbling
Yes.
rapidly what you were told, so I think we'll all take it back and see what we can do about that, or promote it at least. It's an excellent idea.
I will say from UNHCR, one of the things we've talked a lot about internally is what we call digital identity. We're doing a lot more in the way of biometrics. I mean, not just fingerprints, but we use iris scans to register all Syrians and pretty soon all refugees around the world, but we started it off in the Syria situation using iris scans, which is a very reliable biometric identifier, both for purposes of access to assistance and for security purposes. And to the extent to which this and other forms of biometric identification can be used as people move not only around the region, but globally, if they move for work visas, family reunion, even short-term temporary work or education, study, we want biometrics to be able to basically unlock a range of services. So coupled with some sort of a national database where first you verify who you are, and then you have access to all the assistance that might be available to you. I mean, I think that would just be ideal.
Great. Another one to all, from Alexandra Tome. How can we better support and address displaced Palestinian refugees from Syria, given UNRWA's mandate, but also the diminishing resources and services for Palestinian refugees? And maybe we can throw in U.S. government cuts in that question as well. So, did I ramble too much? Did you get the point of my question? How do we better support and address displaced Palestinian refugees from Syria in particular?
Well, I suppose I should speak to that, but I can hardly do so. It's so painful. I mean, they really have been among the worst treated refugees, because everywhere they tried to go, when they tried to leave Syria, they were pushed back or not allowed to come or treated badly. So they've just had the worst of it throughout. And what we're going to do about it, I don't know. There are several countries coming forward to kind of back up that large amount of money, $300 million, that the United States is not giving to UNRWA this year. So I don't know, yeah. Jana, you might probably have more information.
No, I mean, we definitely, UNRWA is a sister agency of UNHCR. UNRWA works in the Palestinian territories and in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. We would be responsible for any Palestinian elsewhere in the region, like in Iraq and in Egypt. We would assist Palestinians the same way we would do any other refugee, whether they came from Syria or elsewhere. The cuts to any UN agency are worrying. We do hope that others in the international community will step up. I think the Palestinian, the unresolved Palestinian situation, regardless of the specific politics involved, is an example of how many years later it affects the willingness of the international community to shoulder yet another situation. I mean, Jordan and Lebanon have been and had been for decades dealing with large numbers of Palestinians. Then Syrians come, and to a certain extent, their response or their hesitancy in how they respond to Syrians is informed in large part by their existing Palestinian situation. So it all goes hand in hand. So when there's a crisis for one agency or one population, everybody needs to step up.
May I
sorry,
just
please,
add
of course.
something? In terms of trying to regroup basically different states that have traditionally chipped in and helped with UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees, the issue was on the agenda of the Arab League, the meeting that just took place in Tehran, Saudi Arabia, and they passed a resolution to contribute to kind of plug that gap in support for UNRWA, and the Saudis made the first donation of 50 million yesterday.
This is to Imad and Daryl from Rosie Berman, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, we need to contend with the reality that many refugees won't be able to return. How do we focus on integration in host communities?
Okay. I'd like to answer that, and I think this is where the issue of education is so important. Educating children, not only in terms of basic education, but giving them skills that transcend the reading, writing, math type of thing. Teaching them distance learning with the latest methods. In other words, let's skip the traditional way of teaching children in terms of education and prepare them for the second half of the 21st century. And I'm saying, teach them new skills, which puts those kids ahead of the curve. So that, for two reasons. One, they can go back at a certain point and rebuild their country. But two, that they can be integrated in the world community. Now look at India. India has one of the most advanced technological group of people, in terms of technology. We in the US, when our computers break down or something, we call in, and the services are provided from India. We get someone who's going to fix your computer here in Washington, D.C., and who's in Delhi or Mumbai. Now, the point is that teaching young people to become global citizens, if they cannot go back to their own country, well, of course, the best thing would be for them to go back. But let's say they're stranded in Europe, they're stranded in Turkey, they're stranded somewhere else. Teach them the skills that will make them part of a global community, and where their participation will be part of they can become an elite rather than those refugees that are sort of trailing behind the poor things. They should be in the front. They could be trained to become brilliant in technology, in the arts, in space. In other words, we can think of new ways of educating young people to make them part of the world, not only of their own countries, and transcend the national boundaries.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in terms of integration, education and employment really are the key, and the two go hand in hand. We find that when parents are not able to work, they're forced to send their kids out and to engage in child labor, which obviously is not very desirable. If the parents can work legally and make a living, they're more likely to send their children to school. I mean, this is really at the heart of this new approach I was talking about, which really kicked off after people started seeing people dying at sea trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. For decades, my agency and the international refugee system has focused on 3 durable solutions: return home, local integration in the host countries, and resettlement. For various reasons, none of those are happening to a large extent. So the reality has been waiting and waiting and waiting. So now we're starting to realize while they're waiting to go home or have another solution, they can't, you don't want them wasting their minds and their productivity. So getting authorization for them to work legally in large numbers, which results in kids going to school in greater numbers, is key. The problem is the host countries are facing their own economic challenges and are hesitant to give work authorization. So what you need to do to encourage that is give them more and greater assistance. So we now have the World Bank and other financial institutions and development agencies stepping in to give concessional loans, grants, other mechanisms whereby the host countries can increase the standard of living for their own citizens and will be more likely to keep hosting refugees and give them access to labor markets.
Yeah, Dennis?
Yes, please.
I'd like to comment a little bit on that. The concept of integration, particularly on a long-term basis, might be easier in the host country today. But as a person of Palestinian background, I emotionally find it very difficult to even engage in that on a long-term basis. Just think of the region. And, look, there is a price if we keep postponing a solution to this problem. If the Syrian refugees get stuck, just like the Palestinian refugees, not only is there an international responsibility and a price affiliated with that, but the price is not only financial. The price, to me, most importantly, is going to become political, security, terrorism, counterterrorism. The region cannot, the way it is right now, the region is in shambles, okay? And it cannot take another 5 to 10 million refugees stuck in limbo in host countries. Host countries can maintain that maybe for a short term, as long as they are benefiting. And by the way, they are not innocent. Most of the host countries are making money, just like they have done with the Palestinian refugees for 7 decades, okay? They are making money out of this disaster. And if they are allowed to continue, I think, first of all, it's gonna bite them in the you-know-what, and then it's also going to bite the international community. So I think it's best for international security and stability to focus on rehabilitation, yes, assistance, yes, but resettlement back in the country itself, in Syria. Otherwise, the region is going to pay a very heavy price, and through that, the international community. Thank you.
Here's 2 questions. I'm going to, they have an overlap, and one is from, it doesn't have a name, so I'll just read it. It's to Khalil and Jana. And then I'll read the next one. Why aren't Arab countries in the Gulf, the much wealthier countries, much wealthier than Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, who share the same religion, why aren't they welcoming and supporting Syrian refugees in their countries? And the other question is also related. It's from Dr. Deeb. Are there any Syrian refugees in Saudi Arabia? So that's for both of you.
Okay, of course, the Saudis are very sensitive to that. They have been aware of the criticism since the beginning of this crisis. Their argument is, and their answer is yes, there are hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in Saudi Arabia. It's not very visible because it's not covered and it's not convincing, frankly. But what they have done is they have simply opened the door legally for families of Syrians who are working in Saudi Arabia, and they are in the hundreds of thousands, to bring in their families for safety, or to allow those who have overstayed in the past. They used to be deported. Now they're allowing them to stay. So their argument is there are several 100,000. How many? I mean, you get conflicting figures. The most reasonable is probably 250,000 in Saudi Arabia. Of course, if there is eventually an accounting for every Syrian refugees, those will have to somehow be accounted for and counted.
Yeah, that's exactly what we hear from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, that they have allowed quietly Syrians under other status to regularize their stay or stay, temporarily for a longer period. And again, as long as Syrians, whether they're technically classified as refugees or not, if they have a fear of persecution returning home, and yet they're not forced to go back home, they're allowed to stay under whatever category you call it. That's what we would hope for. Various countries play different roles in the humanitarian response. Some are major donors, some are large resettlement countries, some allow temporary stay. There are different ways they can contribute to this international responsibility sharing. We look to the Gulf countries not only to continue hosting some Syrians in the ways that they're doing, but also we've tried to get them to step up and be larger donors. It's been a bit of a challenge, but Gulf countries have contributed financially to the response. Some of them prefer to do so bilaterally or through national charities, Islamic charities, as opposed to UN agencies or other forms of assistance. But they are contributing. Kuwait has hosted major donor conferences and has given funding. So we're looking to them through whatever ways they can contribute to the response.
And if I might add just a little bit of the complexity involved here. The Syrian refugees are not homogeneous, okay? As a matter of fact, in a survey we've done earlier on in the crisis, a couple years ago, we were the first research center to actually poll Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. And we found that there are three totally different Syrian communities politically and in terms of their expectations and where they want to go and how they look at the regime and all that. Totally different. It's just the nature of where people found refuge had something to do with their political orientation before they left. And it's very interesting. In terms of the Gulf, I would like to just mention a couple of things. Saudi Arabia, that large bulk tends to be mostly business and working class Syrians. In Qatar, for example, I noticed that most of the Syrians I interact with there tends to be intellectuals. Right? They found refuge in Qatar because it's a little bit freer and support was a bit more flexible for the Syrian opposition to find a free home in Qatar. The numbers are minimal because of the size of the country, okay? So when you compare, by the way, Qatar with 300,000 native population with let's say, Turkey, I bet you there are more Syrians refugees in Qatar per capita than Turkey. Turkey is attributed to being the largest per capita. You go down in the street in Qatar, it's just amazing. Whole, shopping, restaurants, businesses, thriving businesses. The people who are starting new business, particularly with the current crisis in the Gulf, the new milk farmers and then the fancy restaurants emerging in anticipation of the football championships coming up and so on. Syrians all over the place. And so it's every country has its own, Kuwait, I agree, the same thing. Every country has had its own way to react and its own dimension, and they are offended if you say you haven't done anything for the Syrians. Now, one caveat, one warning, you have to also take into consideration the political component of this, in the sense that Gulf countries are not innocent. As the conflict in Syria got internationalized, they came in and they contributed to the conflict. They quickly moved from being part of the solution to being part of the problem by who they supported and how much they supported and how much money they pumped into the fighting. in Syria. So each one has a horse to bet on. And that's why they are finding it difficult now to choose which part of the solution they want to pay for or foot the bill for, because they have been part of the problem in a way.
I have two questions from Catherine Hughes-Freilich of the Center for Peace and Justice to Mary Jane regarding the Refugee Information Hub. What's the status of this initiative? And to Mohammad, how big a challenge is access to the internet or technology in general, especially in camps, in refugee camps? Connecting them to jobs in particular, like, can they get access to technology in order to find these jobs, for one, and for the hub? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll respond to the one on the hub. It was discussed in January in Davos. There was Microsoft, there was MIT, there were other partners at the table. I have received a response from MIT. And so it is at the at the initial stage. I cannot do anything. It was an idea that I brought up. I'm working full time at the Library of Congress, but I was suggesting that an institution pick this idea up because it needs at least a small team of people engaged in pulling together existing resources. Those sources are there. They're available, and bringing together the various organizations that are actually helping both international organizations, of course, the UNHCR, UNICEF, all the major international organizations, but also the private sector. And basically, it's got to be hosted somewhere. And it could be hosted in a university, it could be hosted in a think tank, it could be hosted in various capitals. And what it needs is it needs a small team of people who will pull the existing resources in and then link to the various organizations working on the ground for regular updates. It could be daily updates, and making those available to potential donors. So the idea is there. People are interested in the idea, but it hasn't found a home yet, and it probably needs some initial support to launch it. But there is a great deal of interest in the idea, because people do want to have immediate access. They want to be able to give in different formats. For example, a pharmaceutical company might be interested in giving medicine. A hospital might be willing to provide, I'm saying if we're doing a health, doctors. A university might want to have a professor or grad students work distance for distance learning. Technology companies have all kinds of technologies available for to provide learning via various technologies. For example, one that's a bit old, but there was one laptop per child, and that's a small, cheap computer created by MIT. Solar powered, that could be used in camps and could be used with information sent, from various institutions directly to children to learn. In other words, the information doesn't need to be located in the camp. It could be outside of it, with teachers teaching from Sweden, from England, from Japan, from anywhere. The materials for teaching are available. One doesn't need to reinvent the wheel in every situation. Those materials could be made available. UNHCR and the other organizations are enormously rich in information based on their on a century of assistance or 70 years of assistance to refugees. This information needs to be made available and accessible to people working on the ground and to donors. So it is an idea. It is an idea that a number of institutions are interested in, but it hasn't found a home yet.
So as accessing internet in camps, it is not available for everyone in the camps, but there's some projects provide internet in the camps. But I think if you have a project to teach, to provide a student higher quality education online, part of your project should be providing internet. It is easy to provide. I lived in Syria under ISIL rules, and we have accessing internet more than Washington D.C. and Raqqa. It is not easy to have a satellite to provide internet in camp. If you have a project to provide students education.
This question is from John Anderson. It's to anyone. For a period of time, the U.S. government provided assistance through the Department of State and USAID to local councils in northern Syria that were liberated from Daesh. Although these were not elected bodies, they were provided assistance. 1, was this aid useful to the Syrians? 2, has it helped to address the needs of IDPs and any returning Syrian refugees? And 3, can local groups assisted by the U.S. government and other donors cooperate with central authorities in Damascus as the central government regains national territory? Again, to address humanitarian needs of all these folks.
Khalil has the answers.
Khalil has all the answers.
Quickly, no, and yes.
Okay,
John.
excellent. Next question.
Basically, no. I mean, the attempt to help was very localized, very politicized, very biased, to benefit the U.S. military rather than anybody else. So the trickle-down benefits were rather local, limited geographically, limited socially, and that's why the whole effort fizzled after a while. It just did not produce the maybe intended results on the part of some well-meaning bureaucrat. In terms of the cooperation, I think eventually the public will react, will adjust. So as the Syrian regime reasserts itself, I think you are beginning to see some cooperation because people have no choice. They want to live. Syrians are just like everybody else. They want to survive. And I think if they have learned anything from this crisis is how to be a survivalist population. And unfortunately, they will have to swallow their pride and cooperate and wait for a better day.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So this is from Catherine Abel Thomas, Library of Congress. Given the rightful skepticism surrounding Western involvement and conflicting state interests within the region, what is the likelihood of regional collaboration regarding solutions to the Syrian crisis? And this is directed to Imad and to Khalil, but it's open to anyone.
Go ahead, Brother Imad.
Thank you, Brother Khalil. Well, for one thing, if you want to, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to assist in resolving a problem, you must not have one yourself. Unfortunately, the region is rife with problems, rife with divisions. That does not necessarily preclude the idea of a regional effort to help in Syria. The problem is, like someone mentioned earlier, Khalil, I think, the Arab states have had a little bit of a shoddy kind of record regarding the Syrian civil war. Some of them supported very unsavory characters, and now I don't see how they can go back to the right path and the righteous path, that is. and try to help and think that bygones can be bygones. At the same time, the Arab world is divided. The major fissure today is in the GCC crisis, and the GCC has always been, actually has been since the 1990s, almost the fulcrum of Arab decision making. So if the GCC is undivided, is divided, and there is the current crisis and the virulence of it and the really the sustainability of it, it almost has become a thing that's not going to change at all. I really don't see how the Arab world can really coalesce around some sort of an effort to try to help Syria. That, again, does not preclude the fact that maybe somebody can make a breakthrough, and that is definitely hoped for. But I really would not put my eggs in the Arab world's baskets today.
We just have two questions left, and I think they can be handled quickly. One is to Jana from Daniel Stahl of Georgetown. Is the UNHCR working with organizations like Jesuit Worldwide Learning and Jesuit Refugee Services to deliver higher education to refugee students?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I think there's an organization called Jesuit Commons that does higher education on the margins, I think they refer to it. They're one of our partners in distance learning. We have others. We do, whenever possible, try to facilitate the type of distance learning that was discussed here. We also do a lot on refugee connectivity. You know, one thing I didn't mention, I think most in the audience are probably aware, is that most refugees aren't in camps. In the Syria situation, only about 15% of Syrians in the region are in formal camps. Most are in urban or semi-urban areas where, fortunately, connectivity is a little bit easier. Although in a camp, if you have the resources, you can build a cell tower if you need it. And then, of course, you need access to the mobile phones and charging devices and all of that. So it's nowhere near where we want it to be because it does require funding and partners. But we are making advances both on connectivity in general and on partnerships for distance education, distance learning, yes.
I think this last question fits in perfectly with your answer before it's asked, and I saved this so that you all know I'm not biased and didn't ask this question because it's from Ukhti, Dr. Amira Mohammad from B-Cars, is that how you say that? Anyway. And it's regarding this question of what are the new approaches with the expansion of urban refugees. So it's, as you just said, this is really an urban refugee issue more than a camp issue. And how also does this relate to readmission policies? And finally, camps are still being built until now, but why? Because it seems to hinder the process of integration.
The first part was what are newer approaches
New
to
approaches,
urban refugees? Yeah, that goes back to what I was saying, the recognition that even though countries are very loath to talk about long-term permanent integration, they are willing to open up freedom of movement, access to work visas, access to employment, education, if they're going to get support in doing so. The biggest fear of these countries is that if they integrate these people, the international community will say, okay, we're done with that, on to the next crisis, and they'll be left holding the bag like they have been with Palestinians and others. So if you can give them more, not only loans, because countries don't usually want to take out a loan to help a refugee population, but if they're concessional, very low interest, long repayments, or grants that they're given by the World Bank or other financial institutions with the caveat that they have to use some of that funding to give greater assistance to refugees, then it's a win-win. They help their people and they help the refugees as well. So this is the new development in terms of urban assistance. I mean, the other thing is we're doing much more now in the way of cash rather than, and this is true in camps, rather than giving commodities, we're doing a lot more cash assistance so that people can buy what they need. It's a more dignified existence. And that goes to the second question about camps. I mean, for years we've been moving more and more away from camps. There are very few examples where camps are the better option. That's usually, if you're in a very remote area where there are no urban areas and urban assistance, or if it's a short-term situation. I mean, the advantage is at least you know how many people you have, you can count them, how many schools you have to build, how many latrines, how many health clinics, but it's not a viable, dignified existence. In some cases, though, governments are still requiring us to build or put people in camps, because that's how they feel they'll get the international attention and they'll get the money. So again, if you give them more of that assistance in the urban areas, they have less incentive to feel they need to keep people in camps, unless it's for security purposes, which is a whole other game.
If I may just
Yeah.
The problem with camps, it is a problem. Some states look at camps as a settlement opportunity. In other words, these people are going to become permanent refugees inside the territory, inside the country. And for instance, the Lebanese state and the Lebanese politicians have been really loath to the idea of camps, and they have not built any camps. There are a lot of urban refugees, but not people in camps like Turkey has done or Jordan has done on the border with Syria, specifically because they're afraid of these populations becoming part of the mix of the Lebanese political mix, that is, and which will upset a lot of very delicate power balances.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate it. Thank you to BCARS again for partnering with us. Appreciate that, and we look forward to doing more in the future. Thank you for all the speakers. Please join me in thanking all of them for a great presentation. And one more thank you to the staff of Arab Center Washington and BCARS for their help. Thank you.